23 million years ago, in the early Miocene epoch, a river system began to take shape across the western interior of South America that would eventually surpass every freshwater system known to exist on Earth, before or since. Imagine a landscape not yet divided by the Andes into the basin familiar today, but instead folded into a single immense lowland, fed by rainfall and meltwater accumulating across more than 1 million square kilometers of continental surface. Tectonic subsidence along the eastern flank of the rising Andes created a depression deep enough to trap this water rather than release it quickly to the sea. Over the following 13 million years, that depression filled, drained, and refilled repeatedly, producing a river-wetland complex so vast that its scale would not be matched again until long after it disappeared. The system that emerged from this process has come to be known among geologists as the Pebas system, named for the formation in present-day Peru, where its remains were first identified. At its maximum extent, during the Middle Miocene, estimates derived from sediment mapping place its surface area at over 1 million square kilometers, an area exceeding the combined size of France, Germany, and Spain. By comparison, the modern Amazon River, the largest river on Earth by discharge volume, drains a basin of approximately 7 million square kilometers, but maintains an active channel and floodplain system covering a far smaller fraction of that total at any given moment. The ancient system differed fundamentally in character. Rather than a single dominant channel feeding tributaries, it functioned as an interconnected mosaic of channels, oxbow lakes, swamps, and standing water bodies that shifted position across the landscape on timescales of decades to centuries. Before we continue, take a moment to consider where you're watching from, which country, and how small even the largest modern rivers would seem beside the immense waterway we're about to explore. A river system so vast that it makes the Amazon appear modest by comparison. If these journeys into Earth's distant past are something you enjoy, consider subscribing to continue the adventure. It's always remarkable to see how far these stories travel. Dim the lights, settle into the quiet, and let the modern world drift away as endless channels spread across the landscape, carrying immense volumes of water through a continent that looked nothing like the one we know today. Sediment cores extracted from across the western Amazon basin reveal alternating layers of lacustrine clay, fluvial sand, and organic-rich peat, a stratigraphic signature consistent with a landscape oscillating between open water and vegetated wetland. Current models indicate that water depth across much of the system rarely exceeded 10 meters, yet the surface extent compensated for this shallowness, creating an inland water body that, from any vantage point within it, would have presented a horizon indistinguishable from that of an open sea. Evidence from fossil mollusk assemblages, many belonging to lineages otherwise known only from marine or brackish environments, suggests that portions of the system experienced periodic incursions of saline water, likely connected at times to the Caribbean through a northern outlet rather than draining eastward toward the Atlantic, as the modern river does. This directional difference marks one of the most significant distinctions between the ancient system and its modern descendant. Paleocurrent indicators preserved in sedimentary structures show flow patterns oriented northward for extended intervals, carrying water and sediment toward what is now the Orinoco Basin and the southern Caribbean, rather than toward the Atlantic coast of Brazil. Only later, as the central Andes continued to rise and the eastern shield regions of Brazil and Guyana exerted greater control over regional drainage, did the flow direction reverse, eventually establishing the eastward flowing configuration recognized today. This reversal did not occur as a single event, but unfolded gradually across several million years as the balance of uplift, subsidence, and sediment accumulation shifted incrementally across the basin. The scale of the ancient system becomes more apparent when measured against rivers familiar today. The Mississippi River, the largest in North America by discharge, drains a basin of roughly 3.2 million square kilometers, less than a third the area occupied by the Pabus system at its peak. The Nile, often cited for length rather than volume, drains just over 3 million square kilometers across an entire continent. The ancient South American system exceeded both not through length alone, but through the sheer area of standing and flowing water sustained simultaneously, a condition requiring a specific, persistent combination of tectonic subsidence, high equatorial rainfall, and restricted outflow. Rainfall across the equatorial belt during the Miocene is estimated, based on isotopic analysis of preserved plant material, to have approached or exceeded 2,000 millimeters annually across much of the basin, comparable to or higher than rainfall totals across the modern Amazon. Combined with limited topographic relief across the lowland interior, this rainfall accumulated faster than it could drain, sustaining standing water across enormous areas for years or decades at a time, rather than the seasonal flood pulses that characterize river systems with steeper gradients and more efficient drainage networks. The result was not a river in the conventional sense, defined by a single confined channel, but a continental-scale hydrological system in which the boundary between river, lake, and wetland became functionally meaningless across most of its extent. Reconstructing the precise boundaries of this system requires integrating seismic survey data, outcrop mapping, and microfossil correlation, since no single outcrop preserves its full extent. These independent datasets converge on a consistent picture, a system that persisted with fluctuating boundaries for approximately 13 million years, from roughly 23 to 10 million years ago, making it not only the largest such system identified in the geological record, but also one of the longest lived. The implications of a water body this extensive, sustained this long, extend beyond hydrology alone. A standing or slow-moving freshwater system covering more than 1 million square kilometers for over 10 million years represents a distinct evolutionary arena, isolated in important respects from both the open ocean and from smaller, more transient freshwater habitats elsewhere on the continent. Organisms within it faced selective pressures shaped by chronic low-oxygen conditions in stagnant backwaters, fluctuating salinity near its northern margins, and an abundance of slow-moving, nutrient-rich water unlike anything found in faster-flowing river systems. Within this mosaic, no single channel could be identified as the river in the way that term applies to a modern system such as the Amazon or the Mississippi. Hundreds of interconnected waterways braided across the lowland, separated by low sediment ridges that themselves shifted as channels migrated, were abandoned and reformed elsewhere across the basin. Some channels carried active directional flow at any given time, while adjacent areas, only a few kilometers away, held standing water with negligible current, supporting dense aquatic vegetation rather than open channel conditions. This patchwork meant that the system's boundary, when reconstructed from sediment data, resembles not a single watercourse, but an irregular, continuously changing outline encompassing thousands of individual water bodies. Floodplain deposits associated with the system extend the reconstructed boundary further still, beyond the zones of permanent or near-permanent standing water. Geologists have identified extensive belts of periodically inundated lowland, areas that held water for months or years before drying sufficiently to support different vegetation, only to flood again as nearby channels shifted. Sediment thickness in these transitional zones, measured in some cores at over 200 meters, indicates sustained deposition consistent with repeated flooding rather than a single brief event. Layered sequences of this kind have been traced across distances exceeding 800 kilometers from west to east and a comparable distance north to south, defining a core area of hydrological influence considerably larger than the open water portions alone. At the system's broadest points, particularly during peak subsidence in the Middle Miocene, open water bodies are estimated to have extended across distances of several hundred kilometers without interruption by land. An observer positioned at the center of one of these expanses, had such an observer existed at the time, would have found no shoreline visible in any direction, only the gradual transition of open water into reed-choked margins far beyond the limit of sight. This condition, more characteristic of an inland sea than of any conventional river, is precisely what allows the system to be classified, in scale if not in every structural detail, as exceeding the dimensions of a sea rather than merely a large river. Comparable inland water bodies in Earth's more recent history, including the present-day Caspian Sea, cover a smaller surface area, approximately 371,000 square kilometers, despite being classified geologically as a sea rather than a river system. The persistence of these open water conditions across such large areas for such extended intervals depended on a precise, geologically delicate equilibrium. Subsidence rates along the Andean foreland are estimated to have kept pace with sediment accumulation across most of the basin's history, preventing the system from filling in and converting to dry floodplain even as enormous sediment volumes eroded from the rapidly rising Andes were transported into the lowland each year. Had subsidence outpaced sediment supply, the basin would have deepened into something resembling a true inland sea. Had sediment supply outpaced subsidence, the system would have filled and converted to a conventional floodplain river within a few million years, rather than persisting for 13. The balance that instead prevailed produced a hydrological feature without a clear modern analogue, one that current research continues to characterize through ongoing sediment and fossil analysis across the western Amazon interior. Beneath the surface of the PBAS system, in water often too turbid for light to penetrate more than a meter or two, a community of predators evolved to a scale unmatched by any freshwater ecosystem known from the geological record. Visibility, governed by suspended clay and organic particulate from the surrounding wetlands, frequently fell below 30 centimeters, a constraint that shaped hunting strategy across nearly every major predator in the system. Rather than pursuit through open water, the dominant approach across multiple unrelated lineages converged on ambush, remain motionless, rely on pressure and vibration sensing rather than sight, and strike only once a prey item closed to within body length. Among the largest of these predators was Purosaurus, a Cayman-line crocodilian known from skull material recovered across the western Amazon basin. Reconstructions based on skull length, which in the largest specimens exceeds 1.5 meters, place total body length at approximately 12 to 13 meters, with estimated mass exceeding 8,000 kilograms. This places Purosaurus among the largest crocodilians documented in the fossil record, considerably exceeding the maximum size attained by any crocodilian alive today, including the saltwater crocodile, which rarely surpasses 1,000 kilograms. Bite force estimates derived from skull architecture and jaw muscle reconstruction suggest values near 69,000 newtons, sufficient to fracture the shells of large turtles and the limb bones of medium-sized mammals in a single closure of the jaw. A second crocodilian lineage, Murasuchus, occupied a markedly different ecological role, despite sharing the same waterways. Skull material attributed to this genus shows an elongated, flattened snout exceeding 1 meter in length, combined with small, numerous teeth, poorly suited to processing large prey. Current models interpret this morphology as evidence of filter or sweep-feeding behavior, sweeping the head laterally through schools of small fish and trapping prey en masse, rather than targeting individual large vertebrates. The coexistence of an apex ambush predator and a filter-feeding specialist of comparable body length, estimated at 8 to 10 meters, indicates trophic partitioning that allowed multiple giant crocodilian lineages to persist within the same system without direct competition for identical prey. Gryposuchus, a third crocodilian present in the system, belonged to the gavialid lineage, with a narrow, elongated snout adapted for rapid lateral strikes against fish. Fossil material indicates body lengths reaching 6 to 10 meters, positioning this genus as a specialized piscivore, operating primarily in open channel sections rather than the densely vegetated margins favored by Purosaurus. The presence of 3 large-bodied crocodilian lineages within a single freshwater system, each occupying a distinct feeding niche, has no equivalent in any modern river, where typically only 1 or 2 crocodilian species coexist, each constrained to a narrower range of prey. Fish within the system reached sizes that, in several lineages, approached or exceeded those of the crocodilians hunting them. Catfish belonging to the family Pimelodidae, ancestral to genera still present in the Amazon today, are represented in the fossil record by skull and spine elements, indicating body lengths of 2 meters or more in the largest individuals. These fish, with sensitive barbels capable of detecting vibration and chemical cues in zero-visibility water, occupied benthic zones along channel floors, feeding on smaller fish, mollusks, and organic detritus accumulating in slow-moving sections. Their sensory adaptation to total darkness mirrors the broader pattern of ambush-based predation shaped by the system's persistently turbid water. Lungfish and osteoglossid fish, both lineages predating the Pebas system itself, also achieved substantial size within this environment. Arapaima-line osteoglossids, capable of supplementing gill respiration with atmospheric oxygen through a modified swim bladder, were physiologically suited to the low oxygen conditions prevalent in stagnant backwater zones, where dissolved oxygen levels are estimated, by comparison with similar modern wetlands, to have frequently dropped below 2 milligrams per liter. This air-breathing capacity provided a critical advantage where large areas of standing water experienced seasonal or chronic hypoxia, excluding most exclusively gill-breathing fish from extended occupation. Freshwater stingrays, represented by fossil dermal denticles and tail spines recovered from Pebas-aged sediments, occupied sandy and silty channel bottom habitats, relying on electroreception and pressure sensing to locate buried invertebrate prey where vision offered negligible advantage. Their continued presence in the modern Amazon represents one of the clearest lines of evolutionary continuity between the ancient system and its present-day descendant, despite the dramatic reduction in water extent since. Predation within this system did not proceed along a single linear food chain, but operated as an interlocking network in which several apex predators competed for the same prey base while simultaneously serving, at certain life stages, as prey themselves. Juvenile Purosaurus, before reaching the body size required to deter other large predators, would have remained vulnerable to predation by adult conspecifics, by Gryposuchus, and potentially by the largest catfish species, a pattern of size-structured predation well documented in modern crocodilian populations and considered applicable to their Miocene relatives. This layered structure, in which predator identity shifted by body size rather than species, increased the complexity of trophic interactions beyond what a simple predator-prey hierarchy would predict. Turtles formed a substantial component of the prey base available to these predators, and the system supported several distinct lineages of considerable size. Podocnomidid turtles, a family still represented in the modern Amazon by species such as the giant South American river turtle, are documented in Pebas age deposits by shell fragments, indicating carapace lengths approaching 1 meter in the largest individuals. Their abundance within the fossil assemblage, combined with frequent crushing damage on recovered shell material, consistent in scale with Purosaurus bite force estimates, suggests turtles represented a primary and recurring prey item, their heavily calcified shells providing only partial defense against predators capable of generating sufficient jaw pressure to fracture them. Ambush hunting under near-total visual obstruction required sensory systems calibrated to detect prey through means other than sight. Crocodilian skin across the head and jaw is equipped with clusters of pressure-sensitive receptors capable of detecting water displacement on the scale of single-digit micrometers, allowing a motionless animal submerged in opaque water to register the approach of prey through pressure waves alone, then strike within fractions of a second once contact range was reached. This sensory specialization, present in crocodilian lineages well before the Pebas system formed, would have offered a particular advantage in a system where visual conditions remained poor across nearly the entire extent of standing water, year-round, rather than only during isolated turbid episodes as in many modern rivers. The energetic cost of maintaining an ambush posture for hours without movement was offset by the comparatively low metabolic demands typical of ectothermic predators, allowing large crocodilians to sustain prolonged stillness without significant energy expenditure between successful strikes. This efficiency, combined with the sensory capacity to detect prey without relying on light, allowed multiple large-bodied predator lineages to occupy overlapping territory within the same channels, without the energetic strain that equivalent hunting strategies would impose on a warm-blooded predator of comparable size, a factor that helps account for the unusually high density of large predators the system was able to sustain across its full extent. The persistence of such a dense concentration of large-bodied predators depended directly on the productivity of the wetland system supporting them. Continuous input of organic material from the surrounding floodplain forest, combined with nutrient cycling sustained by seasonal flooding, maintained prey densities sufficient to support multiple apex predator lineages simultaneously, a condition rarely replicated in freshwater systems of smaller extent. Evidence from sediment organic carbon content measured at levels considerably higher than in comparable modern wetland deposits supports the inference that primary productivity across the Pebas system operated at a scale commensurate with the predator community surrounding the open water of the Pebas system, and interwoven directly into its margins stood a forest unlike any that exists in the Amazon basin today. Pollen records extracted from sediment cores across the western basin document a flora dominated by palms, particularly the genus Mauricia, occurring in such density that individual pollen samples from this interval frequently register palm pollen at proportions exceeding 50% of total identifiable grains. This abundance indicates a landscape in which palm-dominated wetland forest, rather than the high canopy hardwood forest characteristic of upland Amazonia today, extended continuously across enormous areas of seasonally and permanently inundated ground. The structure of this forest was dictated directly by water tolerance. trees capable of persisting with their root systems submerged for months or years at a time, a physiological constraint requiring specialized tissue capable of functioning under low oxygen conditions, dominated the canopy across the wetland interior, while less flood-tolerant species were restricted to slightly elevated ground along the margins of the system, areas that flooded only briefly during peak high water periods. This division produced a forest organized not primarily by elevation in the conventional sense, since relief across the basin rarely exceeded a few meters, but by flood duration, with species composition shifting measurably across distances of less than 1 kilometer as ground elevation changed by less than a meter. Wood anatomy preserved in fossil material from this interval shows adaptations consistent with this flooding regime, including expanded vascular tissue capable of transporting oxygen to submerged root systems and growth ring patterns suggesting episodic rather than continuous radial growth, consistent with trees experiencing extended dormancy during periods of maximum inundation. These anatomical signatures, comparable to those found in flood-tolerant tree species occupying the seasonally flooded Várzea forests of the modern Amazon, indicate that the physiological strategies required to survive in a wetland-dominated landscape were already well established among South American tree lineages by the Middle Miocene, more than 10 million years before the modern Amazon basin took its current form. Canopy height across this forest, reconstructed from leaf-size distributions and comparison with modern analog ecosystems, is estimated to have remained lower than that of modern terra firme Amazonian forest, likely in the range of 20 to 30 meters across much of the wetland interior, compared to canopy heights regularly exceeding 40 meters in non-flooded forest today. This reduced stature reflects the physiological cost of sustaining vascular tissue capable of withstanding prolonged waterlogging, a cost that appears to have constrained maximum tree height even as it permitted survival under conditions that would exclude most non-adapted tree species entirely. Animal communities within this forest depended directly on the flood cycle governing its structure. Fossil evidence of fruit and seed consumption, preserved in the form of damaged endocarps and associated dental microwear patterns on mammalian teeth recovered from the same sediment sequence, indicates that frugivory was a dominant feeding strategy among the forest's mammalian inhabitants, a pattern consistent with the high fruit productivity typical of palm-dominated wetland forest, where individual Mauritia palms can produce several hundred kilograms of fruit annually under favorable conditions. This fruit resource, concentrated within a forest type that itself depended entirely on the flood regime of the surrounding wetland system, created a direct ecological link between the hydrology of the Pebas system and the food availability sustaining its resident mammal community. Seasonal and multi-year flooding cycles required animal populations within this forest to adopt one of several survival strategies. Some lineages, evidenced by skeletal proportions suited to swimming and by isotopic signatures indicating sustained aquatic foraging, appear to have remained within flooded areas throughout the inundation period, exploiting submerged and floating vegetation directly. Others show evidence of seasonal movement toward higher, less frequently flooded ground at the margins of the system, a pattern inferred from the spatial distribution of fossil localities relative to reconstructed flood boundaries, with certain taxa appearing disproportionately in deposits associated with marginal, less persistently inundated terrain. The combined productivity of this flooded forest system, measured through proxies including sediment organic carbon accumulation rates and the density and diversity of preserved plant macrofossils, places it among the most productive terrestrial ecosystems documented from the Miocene epoch anywhere in the world. Estimates derived from comparison with structurally similar modern flooded forest systems suggest net primary productivity in the range of 1,000 to 1,500 grams of carbon per square meter annually, a figure consistent with sustained, high-volume biomass turnover capable of supporting the dense and taxonomically diverse animal community documented in the associated fossil record. Root architecture within the flooded forest interior diverged substantially from that typical of non-flooded tropical forest. Fossilized root casts and associated sediment structures indicate widespread development of stilt roots and pneumatophores, specialized above-ground or partially exposed root structures that allow gas exchange when the surrounding soil becomes saturated and anoxic. This adaptation, still characteristic of flood-tolerant tree genera in the modern Amazon, appears in the Pebas age fossil record across multiple unrelated plant lineages, indicating that the selective pressure imposed by prolonged waterlogging acted broadly across the forest's flora, rather than being confined to a small number of specialized taxa, a pattern consistent with convergent evolution under a shared environmental constraint operating across the full 13 million year duration of the system. Terrestrial predators occupying the forest margins faced a hunting environment shaped by the same flooding dynamics governing plant and herbivore distribution. Fossil material attributed to large sporacodont carnivores, a now extinct lineage of carnivorous mammals that filled apex predator roles across much of Miocene South America prior to the arrival of placental carnivorans from North America, has been recovered from deposits associated with the elevated, less frequently inundated margins of the Pebas system, suggesting these predators concentrated activity in zones where dry ground hunting remained possible across most of the annual cycle, rather than within the seasonally or permanently flooded forest interior occupied primarily by aquatic and semi-aquatic species. Diversity within this system, assessed through the number of distinct plant and animal taxa identified across sediment sequences spanning its 13 million year history, exceeds that recorded from any other Miocene age depositional system in South America, and compares favorably with estimates of diversity in the modern Amazon basin itself, despite the considerably smaller total sampling effort applied to deposits of this age. This pattern, evident across multiple independently sampled localities rather than concentrated at a single site, supports the inference that the combination of extensive flooded forest, abundant fruit resources, and a 13 million year span of relatively stable environmental conditions allowed biological diversity to accumulate to levels rarely matched elsewhere in the geological record of comparable age. Each year, as the wet season advanced across the equatorial belt feeding the Pebas system, rainfall accumulating across the Andean foothills and lowland interior drove water levels upward across the basin by several meters within weeks. Sediment evidence indicates this annual rise was not confined to established channels, but spread laterally across the floodplain, converting areas that had supported terrestrial vegetation only months earlier into open or semi-open water, a transformation occurring across thousands of square kilometers simultaneously rather than gradually. The scale of this seasonal inundation exceeded that documented in any modern river system. Where the modern Amazon experiences an annual water level fluctuation of approximately 10 meters at certain points, flooding a floodplain extending tens of kilometers from the main channel, sediment and pollen evidence from the Pebas system indicates flood extents reaching considerably further, in places exceeding 100 kilometers from the nearest permanent channel, a consequence of the extremely low relief characterizing the basin during the Miocene. With elevation change across much of the lowland measured in centimeters, Even a modest rise in water level translated into lateral flooding across enormous distances. This pattern of inundation did not follow a single predictable annual cycle in the way flood pulses do in many modern rivers. Evidence from layered sediment sequences in which alternating bands of aquatic and terrestrial deposits vary considerably in thickness from one cycle to the next indicates substantial year-to-year variability in flood magnitude, with some intervals showing multi-year inundation during which areas remained underwater continuously for 2 or more consecutive wet seasons before sufficient drainage allowed temporary terrestrial conditions to return. This irregularity meant that no fixed boundary between aquatic and terrestrial habitat existed at any point during the system's 13-million-year history. Plant communities adapted to this irregular flooding regime through mechanisms allowing survival across a wide range of inundation durations rather than a single fixed flood season. Seed dispersal by water, evidenced by buoyant seed coat structures preserved in several fossil plant taxa, allowed reproduction to proceed even when adult plants remained partially or fully submerged for extended periods, with seeds carried by floodwater to newly exposed ground once water levels eventually receded. This strategy, still characteristic of flood-tolerant plant lineages in the modern Amazon, appears to have been the dominant mode of dispersal across much of the Peibas system's plant community, reflecting the practical reality that a forest, spending much of its existence underwater, required reproductive mechanisms compatible with aquatic transport. Animal populations exhibited a comparable range of responses to the unpredictable flood regime. Fossil trackways and burrow casts preserved in sediment associated with seasonally exposed ground indicate some terrestrial species timed reproduction and activity to coincide with predictable low-water intervals, concentrating feeding and movement into months when dry ground was reliably available. Other taxa, identified through skeletal and isotopic evidence indicating sustained semi-aquatic lifestyles, appear to have remained active throughout the flood cycle regardless of water level, exploiting the temporary abundance of aquatic habitat created each time the system's boundaries expanded. The continuous redistribution of sediment during flood events drove ongoing physical reshaping of the landscape. Suspended sediment, derived primarily from erosion of the rapidly uplifting Andes to the west, was deposited unevenly across the inundated floodplain as water slowed and spread. Sediment accumulation rates reconstructed from core data suggest deposition of several millimeters to several centimeters of new material during a single major flood event, a rate sufficient to measurably alter local topography within a single annual cycle, and, compounded across thousands of such cycles, sufficient to account for the considerable total sediment thickness, in places exceeding several hundred meters, documented across the basin's depositional history. Fish populations within the system appear to have synchronized key life cycle events with the flood cycle, a pattern inferred from growth increment analysis in fossil otoliths, the calcified ear structures used to reconstruct age and growth rate in extinct fish. Increment spacing in specimens recovered from Peibas-age deposits shows periodic acceleration in growth rate consistent with seasonal increases in food availability, linked to the influx of organic material and newly accessible floodplain habitat during high water periods, a pattern mirroring the flood pulse productivity dynamic documented in the modern Amazon today. Levee formation along active channels created a secondary landscape structure layered atop the broader flood regime. As floodwater slowed upon leaving confined channels, the coarsest sediment fraction settled first, building elevated ridges adjacent to the channel margin that stood, in places, 1 to 2 meters above the surrounding backswamp floor. These levees, modest in height, represented some of the only consistently dry ground available across large sections of the floodplain during peak flood periods, concentrating terrestrial animal activity along narrow corridors, paralleling active channels, a pattern preserved in the clustering of trace fossils along reconstructed paleo-levee positions relative to backswamp deposits further from the channel. The cumulative effect of repeated levee construction, channel migration, and backswamp sedimentation was a landscape in constant, gradual reorganization. Individual channels are estimated, based on the lateral extent of point bar deposits, to have shifted position by as much as several kilometers over centuries to a few thousand years, abandoning previous courses to become isolated oxbow lakes while establishing new channels elsewhere. Over the full 13 million year duration of the system, this continuous migration ensured that no area of the floodplain remained in an identical hydrological state for more than a few thousand years at most, meaning the landscape experienced by any generation differed measurably from that of their ancestors only a few millennia earlier. This combination of lateral flooding extent, irregular multi-year inundation, and continuous sediment redistribution distinguishes the Pebas system from flood regimes documented in any river system today, positioning it less as a conventional seasonal flood pulse and more as a slow, continuous renegotiation of the boundary between land and water across a continental scale, repeated with variation across 13 million years of sustained activity. Along the margins where the Pebas system's floodplain forest gave way to open water, a distinct community of large-bodied animals concentrated their activity, drawn by the dense vegetation and reliable water access available nowhere else across the surrounding landscape. Fossil deposits recovered from these marginal zones, distinguished from open water and deep forest assemblages by their sediment composition and faunal content, document a disproportionately high concentration of large mammalian herbivores relative to deposits from either fully terrestrial or fully aquatic settings, indicating that the shoreline functioned as a distinct ecological zone. Among the largest herbivores documented from this interval was Granostrapotherium, an astropathere known primarily from skull and limb material recovered from Miocene-age deposits in present-day Colombia, within the broader geographic range associated with the Pebas system. Body mass estimates derived from limb bone circumference place this animal in the range of 3 to 4 metric tons, comparable to a modern white rhinoceros, with an elongated, mobile upper lip and reduced tusk-like upper canines, suggesting a feeding strategy centered on stripping vegetation from low branches and aquatic plants. Skeletal proportions, including comparatively short limbs relative to body mass, have led current models to interpret astropatheres as likely semi-aquatic in habit, spending substantial time in shallow water and saturated ground along channel margins in a manner broadly analogous to the modern hippopotamus, despite sharing no close evolutionary relationship. Note ungulates, an order of hoofed mammals unique to South America and without surviving descendants today, contributed several additional large-bodied herbivore lineages to the shoreline community. Skull and dental material recovered from marginal deposits indicates body masses in some taxa exceeding 500 kilograms, with dental wear patterns suggesting a mixed diet of grasses, aquatic vegetation, and browse, consistent with animals exploiting the diverse plant resources concentrated along the boundary between water and forest. The presence of multiple notungulate lineages within the same habitat, each showing distinct dental specializations, indicates dietary partitioning comparable to that observed among large herbivore communities in modern African wetland ecosystems, allowing several species of considerable size to coexist without direct competition for identical food resources. Large flightless birds also occupied portions of this shoreline environment, though their fossil record from the Pebas system itself remains comparatively sparse relative to better documented occurrences elsewhere in South America. Phorushasid birds, a lineage of large terrestrial predators reaching heights of up to 2.5 meters in the largest known species, are represented across Miocene-aged South American deposits more broadly by skeletal material indicating powerful, hooked beaks adapted for delivering forceful strikes to prey, and current models place these birds among the dominant terrestrial predators across open and semi-open habitats of the period, including, plausibly, the drier margins bordering the Pebas wet. The boundary zone between water and land represented one of the most consistently dangerous environments available to any animal within the system, owing to the concentration of ambush predators positioned to exploit this transition. Crocodilians, relying on camouflage and stillness in shallow water immediately adjacent to the shoreline, were positioned to intercept herbivores approaching the water's edge to drink, feed on aquatic vegetation, or cross between separated areas of forest, a pattern of predation risk documented indirectly through the disproportionate representation of partial, disarticulated herbivore skeletons in sediment immediately adjacent to reconstructed channel margins, consistent with carcasses processed near the point of capture rather than This concentration of predation risk at the shoreline appears to have shaped herbivore behavior in ways inferable from trackway evidence preserved in exposed mudflat surfaces along several reconstructed paleo-channel margins. Trackway patterns showing clustered, closely spaced footprints approaching the water's edge, followed by abrupt directional changes away from the shoreline, suggest cautious, hesitant approach behavior consistent with elevated predation risk at the point of water contact, comparable to that documented among modern large herbivores approaching waterholes known to harbor ambush predators in present-day African and South Asian ecosystems. Seasonal flooding directly influenced the movement patterns of shoreline-dependent herbivores across the landscape. As water levels rose and previously accessible marginal habitat became submerged, herbivore populations are inferred, based on the shifting spatial distribution of trackway and skeletal evidence across different stratigraphic intervals, to have relocated toward higher, less frequently inundated ground at greater distance from the main channels. This pattern of flood-driven movement represents one of the earliest documented instances of large-scale herbivore migration linked directly to a freshwater flood regime within the South American fossil record. Predating by many millions of years the comparable, smaller-scale migratory patterns observed among ungulates along the modern Amazon's seasonally flooded margins. Ground sloths, represented in marginal deposits by isolated limb and claw material, contributed a further dimension to the shoreline herbivore community, though their ecological role differed substantially from that of the Astropotheres and Nota ungulates sharing the same habitat. Claw morphology in the recovered material, broad and only moderately curved compared to the more strongly recurved claws of later, more specialized arboreal sloths, is consistent with a ground-dwelling existence, likely supplemented by selective browsing on low vegetation along forest margins rather than the semi-aquatic foraging inferred for Astropotheres. Body size estimates for these early sloth lineages remain considerably more modest than the multi-ton giants that would later characterize the group during the Pleistocene, generally falling in the range of 100 to 300 kilograms. Juvenile mortality at the shoreline appears, based on the age distribution of recovered skeletal material, to to have been disproportionately concentrated relative to that documented in deposits from more interior, less predator-dense portions of the landscape. Bone assemblages from marginal sediment show a higher proportion of subadult and juvenile individuals among herbivore taxa compared to assemblages from forest interior deposits of equivalent age, a pattern consistent with elevated predation pressure on younger, smaller, and less experienced animals navigating the heightened risk associated with shoreline foraging, mirroring age-structured predation patterns documented among large herbivores occupying predator-dense waterhole margins. In modern ecosystems, the concentration of large-bodied herbivores, large predatory birds, and ambush-hunting crocodilians along a single continuous shoreline extending across more than 1 million square kilometers of wetland margin represents a density and diversity of large animal interaction unmatched by any freshwater shoreline documented elsewhere in the geological record, a consequence directly attributable to the unprecedented scale of the water body generating and sustaining that shoreline throughout its 13 million years ago. At its broadest points, the open water portions of the PBAS system developed physical characteristics typically associated with marine environments rather than river systems, a consequence of wind acting across uninterrupted expanses of water extending in places beyond 100 kilometers from shore to shore. Wind fetch, the distance over which wind blows continuously across open water without obstruction, governs wave height through a well-established physical relationship in which longer fetch distances permit larger waves to develop. Sedimentary structures preserved in deposits from the system's open water zones, including symmetrical ripple marks and wave-generated cross-bedding, indicate sustained wave action consistent with fetch distances far exceeding those typical of confined river channels, supporting reconstruction of these zones as functioning hydrodynamically more like a sea than a conventional waterway. Storm-generated sediment layers identified through abrupt grain size changes and erosional surfaces interrupting otherwise gradual depositional sequences appear at intervals throughout cores recovered from the system's central basin. These layers, structurally comparable to storm deposits documented in coastal marine settings and informally termed tempestites, where they occur in such contexts, indicate episodic high-energy events capable of redistributing bottom sediment across the open water portions of the system, a process requiring wind speeds and wave energy substantially exceeding background conditions. Current models attribute these events to convective storm systems crossing the open water expanse, generated by the same atmospheric instability that produces severe thunderstorms over large bodies of water in tropical regions today, intensified here by the unusually large surface area available for energy accumulation before storms made landfall along the system's forested margins. Within this expanse of open water, elevated landforms persisted as semi-permanent islands, their existence and position documented through localized concentrations of root traces and terrestrial sediment surrounded by lacustrine deposits in the surrounding stratigraphy. These islands formed primarily through consolidation of sediment at locations where channel dynamics favored deposition over erosion across multiple consecutive flood cycles, supported vegetation distinct from that of the surrounding open water, evidenced by pollen assemblages recovered from island deposits, showing a higher proportion of taxa associated with better drained substrate compared to pollen recovered from adjacent open water sediment. The persistence of individual islands across multiple stratigraphic intervals, in some cases representing several thousand years of continuous existence before eventual erosion or submergence, indicates these features functioned as stable, if temporary, terrestrial refugia within an otherwise predominantly aquatic landscape. Lagoons, areas of calmer, often higher salinity water partially separated from the main body of the system by sediment barriers or restricted channel connections, occur at multiple points within the depositional sequence, identified through fossil mollusk assemblages, dominated by salinity-tolerant taxa, alongside sediment geochemistry, indicating periodically restricted water exchange. These lagoonal environments, concentrated primarily along the northern margins of the system where connection to the Caribbean periodically introduced marine or brackish water, represent a distinct subset of the broader open water environment, characterized by reduced wave energy relative to the main basin and a correspondingly different sediment and faunal signature, evidence that the PBUS system encompassed not a single uniform body of water, but a mosaic of distinct hydrological sub-environments operating under different physical and chemical conditions simultaneously. Channels within the system's interior, despite the overall openness of much of the water body, frequently became obscured by dense aquatic and floating vegetation, a condition inferred from sediment cores showing localized concentrations of organic material consistent with extensive mats of floating plants accumulating across slow-moving or stagnant channel sections. Where such vegetation mats developed, underlying channels would have remained functionally hidden from surface observation despite continuing to carry water and sediment beneath the floating cover, a configuration that complicates reconstruction of the system's active channel network at any given point in its history, since standard sedimentary indicators of channel position can be partially masked by the organic deposits associated with vegetation mat cover. Quantitative reconstruction of wave conditions across the system's central basin, derived from ripple wavelength and cross-bedding geometry preserved in core samples, suggests significant wave heights, at times exceeding 1 meter under typical wind conditions, with storm-associated deposits indicating episodic wave heights reaching 2 to 3 meters during the most intense convective events documented in the sediment record. While modest compared to wave heights generated across true oceanic basins, these figures substantially exceed wave conditions typical of confined river channels, where limited fetch generally restricts wave development to a few centimeters at most, reinforcing the characterization of the PBUS system's open water zones as functioning, in physical process, if not in chemical composition, more like an inland sea than any conventional freshwater river. Geochemical analysis of shell material recovered from lagoonal deposits provides additional resolution on the salinity gradients structuring this mosaic of sub-environments. Oxygen and strontium isotope ratios measured in mollusk shells from different localities within the system show systematic variation consistent with a salinity gradient extending from fully freshwater conditions across the southern and western basin to measurably brackish conditions concentrated along the northern margin nearest the Caribbean connection, with intermediate values recorded at lagoonal localities positioned between these extremes. This geochemical mapping, conducted across multiple independent localities spanning several million years of the system's history, demonstrates that the boundary between freshwater and brackish conditions was not fixed in position but shifted over time in response to changes in the relative strength of northern marine influence versus southern and western freshwater input, a dynamic balance preserved as a measurable isotopic signature across the system's full depositional history. Reconstructing the most remote and poorly sampled reaches of this system remains an active area of ongoing geological investigation, constrained by the limited number of locations where deep cores or extensive outcrop exposure provide direct access to sediment from the system's interior. Much of the available evidence derives from petroleum exploration boreholes drilled for purposes unrelated to paleoenvironmental reconstruction, meaning the spatial distribution of available data is itself a product of resource exploration patterns rather than systematic scientific sampling, leaving substantial areas of the reconstructed basin represented by sparse or entirely absent direct sedimentary evidence. Current models of the system's extent and internal structure therefore rely heavily on interpolation between widely spaced data points, a limitation that leaves considerable uncertainty regarding the precise configuration of the system's most remote central and northern reaches, areas that, on the basis of available indirect evidence, are hypothesized to have included some of the largest and most persistently open stretches of water documented anywhere within the system's 13-million-year history. Competition among the Pay bass system's apex predators extended beyond the partitioning of prey resources into direct contests over physical space, evidence for which survives in the skeletal record of the animals themselves. Skull material attributed to Purosaurus frequently exhibits healed puncture wounds and fracture patterns concentrated on the lateral surfaces of the snout and jaw, a distribution of injury inconsistent with damage sustained during prey capture, where bite trauma typically concentrates on the prey item rather than the predator, and more consistent with injuries received during direct combat between individuals of the same or comparable species, a pattern well documented in modern crocodilians engaged in territorial disputes over premium basking sites, nesting locations, or access to the most productive ambush positions along a channel margin. The physical layout of the system created a limited number of locations offering optimal hunting conditions, a constraint that intensified competition for those positions specifically. Channel confluences, where two or more waterways merged and funneled prey movement through a comparatively narrow zone, represent one such category of premium territory, identified in the sediment record by unusually dense concentrations of fragmented and partially consumed prey, remains relative to surrounding deposits, consistent with repeated, sustained predation activity concentrated at these geographically constrained pinch points, rather than distributed evenly across the broader system. Possession of such a location would have conferred a substantial energetic advantage to whichever predator successfully held it, creating direct selective pressure favoring the body size and combat capability necessary to displace or deter rival claimants. This pressure appears to have contributed to an escalating pattern of size increase documented across the stratigraphic sequence of Purosaurus specimens recovered from the system. Skull length measurements from securely dated specimens show a general increase through the middle portion of the Miocene interval represented by the Pay bass system, with the largest individuals concentrated in deposits corresponding to the period of the system's maximum extent, a correlation consistent with the interpretation that increasing competition for limited premium territory intensified as the overall predator population grew alongside the expanding habitat available to support it. Turtles occupying the system developed correspondingly robust defensive adaptations over the same interval, a pattern interpretable as one component of a broader predator-prey arms race operating across the system's 13-million-year duration. Shell thickness measurements taken from podocnemidid turtle fossils recovered across successive stratigraphic intervals show a measurable increase over time, with shell material from later deposits exhibiting greater average thickness than comparable material from earlier in the sequence, a trend plausibly linked to sustained selective pressure exerted by increasingly powerful crocodilian bite forces across the same time span. Though confounding factors, including changes in turtle body size and species composition, complicate a fully isolated causal interpretation of this pattern. Spatial zonation among the system's major predator lineages reduced, though did not eliminate, direct competitive overlap across the full extent of available habitat. Sediment and fossil distribution data indicate that Purosaurus remains concentrate disproportionately in deposits associated with densely vegetated channel margins and backwater zones, offering maximum concealment for ambush hunting, while Gryposuchus remains occur more frequently in deposits associated with open channel sections better suited to its pursuit-oriented, fish-focused hunting strategy. Morosuchus remains, consistent with its filter-feeding ecology, appear concentrated in deposits associated with broader, shallower lake and lagoon environments, offering sustained access to dense schools of small fish, a spatial separation that allowed the system's largest predators to coexist at high population density without engaging in continuous, energetically costly, direct competition across their entire respective ranges. Where these zones of habitat preference did overlap, particularly at the margins between vegetated backwater and open channel, evidence of direct interspecific conflict appears in the fossil record in the form of bite marks attributable to one large predator species found on bone material belonging to another. Such marks, while comparatively rare relative to the overall volume of recovered fossil material, document instances of either predation by one large crocodilian species on another or combat between competing predators over contested territory or captured prey, providing direct physical evidence that the boundaries between predator territories functioned as zones of active, sometimes lethal, conflict rather than passive lines of habitat separation. Cannibalism, documented through crocodilian bite marks identified on juvenile Purosaurus bone material recovered from the same deposits that preserve adult remains, represents a further dimension of this competitive landscape, one in which territorial conflict extended beyond adult rivals to include the offspring of competing or even resident individuals. Current models interpret this pattern as consistent with behavior documented among modern large crocodilians, in which adult individuals, particularly males defending established territory, will opportunistically consume juveniles encountered within contested or actively defended space, whether as a direct territorial behavior, an incidental consequence of generalized predatory opportunism, or some combination of both factors operating simultaneously within a population under sustained competitive pressure for limited prime habitat. The annual flood cycle introduced a recurring disruption to whatever territorial stability individual predators managed to establish during low water periods. As rising water submerged the channel margins and confined backwaters that had functioned as defended ambush territory during the dry season, the physical boundaries defining those territories effectively dissolved, forcing a renegotiation of spatial claims once water levels receded and the same premium locations became available again, now potentially contested by individuals that had been displaced elsewhere during the inundation. This cyclical pattern of territorial dissolution and reformation, repeated with each major flood event across the system's 13-million-year history, would have prevented any single predator lineage or set of individuals from establishing fully permanent control over the most productive hunting locations, sustaining instead a perpetual cycle of competitive renegotiation tied directly to the broader hydrological rhythm governing the entire system. The cumulative picture emerging from this evidence describes a system in which the abundance of prey, while substantial, was insufficient to eliminate competitive pressure among the predators positioned to exploit it, a consequence of the sheer number and size of apex predators the system's productivity allowed to coexist simultaneously. Rather than a landscape of passive abundance, the paybass system functioned at its predatory apex as a continuously contested territory in which survival depended not only on successful prey capture, but on the capacity to claim, defend, and retain access to the specific physical locations where prey capture was most reliably achieved. Beneath the seasonally fluctuating surface conditions governing most of the PBAS system, certain deep channel pools maintained comparatively stable physical conditions throughout the annual cycle, persisting as permanent refugia even as surrounding shallower water disappeared entirely during periods of extreme low water. Sediment evidence indicates these pools, concentrated at points where channel geometry favored localized scour and deepening, could reach depths considerably exceeding the 1 to 2 meters typical of the broader system, in places approaching 10 meters or more, a depth sufficient to maintain standing water and relatively stable temperature conditions year-round, regardless of seasonal fluctuation, across the shallower majority of the system. This environmental stability allowed deep channel pools to function as evolutionary refugia for lineages adapted to conditions of permanent darkness and chemical stratification, rather than the fluctuating light and oxygen levels characterizing shallower portions of the system. Gymnotiform fish, an order of weakly electric fish that diversified extensively across South American freshwater systems during the Cenozoic, are represented in Miocene-age deposits from the broader region by fossil material, indicating an electroreceptive sensory system already well established by this interval, with specialized electric organs generating low-voltage fields used to detect prey, navigate, and communicate with conspecifics in water where vision provided negligible functional advantage. This electrolocation strategy, requiring no light whatsoever to function, represents one of the most specialized sensory adaptations documented from the system, allowing these fish to occupy permanently dark, deep channel habitat largely unavailable to vision-dependent predators and prey alike. Lungfish inhabiting the system's deep channels and adjacent backwaters relied on a markedly different strategy for surviving the most extreme conditions associated with seasonal water loss. Where deep pools themselves failed to provide sufficient refuge during the most severe low water intervals, evidence from comparable modern lungfish behavior, combined with the physiological capacity for aerial respiration already established in this lineage, supports the inference that PBAS system lungfish were capable of estivation, a dormant state in which the animal burrows into saturated mud, secretes a protective mucus cocoon, and reduces metabolic activity to a fraction of active levels. This capacity, documented in lungfish lineages extending back considerably further than the PBAS system itself, represents one of the oldest continuously employed survival strategies present among the system's aquatic inhabitants. Mollusk faunas recovered from deep channel deposits show a distinct composition relative to shallower portions of the system, dominated by taxa adapted to low oxygen, low light conditions. Several gastropod and bivalve lineages identified from these deposits belong to groups with fossil records extending back considerably earlier than the PBAS system's formation, indicating that deep channel habitat functioned as a refuge, allowing certain ancient mollusk lineages to persist largely unchanged across the system's full duration, isolated to a degree from the more rapidly shifting selective pressures operating across the shallower, more variable portions of the broader wetland complex. The relative taxonomic stability documented within this deep channel mollusk assemblage, compared to the more dynamic turnover observed among shallow water and floodplain taxa over the same interval, supports the characterization of deep channel pools as zones of relative evolutionary stasis within an otherwise rapidly changing system. Catfish lineages occupying the deepest, most persistently dark channel zones exhibit skeletal features, including reduced relative eye socket size in several specimens compared to closely related taxa recovered from shallower deposits, consistent with reduced reliance on vision and correspondingly greater investment in non-visual sensory structures, including the barbel and lateral line systems already well developed across catfish more broadly. This pattern of sensory reduction and compensation, while less extreme than the complete eye loss documented in certain modern cave-adapted fish lineages, indicates measurable adaptation to the specific conditions of permanent darkness characterizing the system's deepest channel habitat, distinct from the merely turbid but periodically lit conditions prevailing across most of the broader system's open water. Chemical conditions within the deepest pools frequently developed pronounced stratification, with surface water remaining relatively well oxygenated, while bottom layers, isolated from atmospheric exchange by depth and by the limited water movement characteristic of these refugia, accumulated dissolved hydrogen sulfide and other byproducts of microbial decomposition acting on accumulated organic material at the channel floor. Sediment geochemistry from several deep pool deposits indicates conditions consistent with this kind of persistent chemical layering, comparable to the stratification documented in stagnant deep basins within certain modern tropical lakes, where a stable boundary separates an oxygenated upper layer from an anoxic, sulfide-rich lower layer that few multicellular organisms can tolerate for extended periods. Organisms capable of exploiting this boundary zone, including specialized bacteria and a limited number of tolerant invertebrate lineages, would have occupied an ecological niche entirely absent from the shallower, better mixed portions of the broader system. Microfossil assemblages recovered from deep channel sediment, particularly ostracods, small bivalved crustaceans with calcified shells, well preserved in fine-grained anoxic mud, provide a level of chronological and environmental resolution unavailable from larger skeletal material alone. Distinct ostracod species assemblages, each associated with specific combinations of oxygen level, salinity, and water depth, allow researchers to reconstruct fine-scale environmental conditions within individual deep pool deposits with a precision exceeding what coarser sedimentary or larger fossil evidence permits. This microfossil record confirms that certain deep channel locations maintained consistent, low-oxygen, stratified conditions across intervals spanning hundreds of thousands of years, supporting the broader characterization of these pools as unusually stable, long-persisting features within a system otherwise defined by near-constant physical change. The degree of isolation experienced by populations occupying these deep channel refugia, particularly during the most severe low-water intervals when surrounding shallow habitat became entirely unavailable, may have contributed to localized genetic divergence among populations separated by intervening dry terrain, though direct evidence for this process from the fossil record alone remains limited, given the comparative difficulty of resolving fine-scale population structure from skeletal material rather than genetic data. Current models nonetheless treat the deep channel network as a plausible mechanism for generating and maintaining a degree of biological diversity disproportionate to its limited total area, a consequence of the combination of environmental stability, sensory specialization, and partial isolation, distinguishing this habitat from every other zone within the PBAS system's broader hydrological mosaic. The formation of a freshwater system on the scale of the PBAS wetland required a specific and improbable convergence of tectonic, climatic, and geographic conditions, the absence of any one of which would likely have prevented the system from forming. The process began with subduction of the Nazca Oceanic Plate, beneath the western margin of South America, a process already active for tens of millions of years before the PBAS system formed, but which intensified measurably during the early Miocene, driving accelerated uplift of the Andes at rates estimated, based on thermochronological data from exhumed rock samples, to have reached several hundred meters per million years across portions of the central and northern Andes during this interval. This accelerated uplift produced two interconnected consequences essential to the wetland system's formation. First, the growing mountain range generated an enormous and continuously renewed supply of eroded sediment, carried eastward by rivers draining the rising Andean slopes into the adjacent lowland. Second, the weight of the thickening mountain belt depressed the adjacent crust through a process known as flexural loading, creating an elongated depression termed a foreland basin, running parallel to the mountain front across what is now the western Amazon basin. This depression, rather than sediment supply alone, provided the essential accommodation space without which incoming sediment would simply have filled and leveled the landscape, rather than sustaining a persistent, long-lived wetland. The relationship between sediment supply and subsidence rate determined the resulting landscape's character with considerable precision. Had erosion from the Andes outpaced basin subsidence, sediment would have accumulated faster than the depression could deepen, filling the foreland basin and producing a conventional, well-drained floodplain rather than a persistently flooded wetland. Had subsidence instead substantially outpaced sediment supply, the basin would have deepened into a true, permanently submerged inland sea, more closely resembling a lake than the dynamic mosaic of channels, lakes, and seasonally flooded forest that actually formed. Borehole data indicate subsidence and sediment supply remained in approximate, though imperfect, balance across most of the system's 13-million-year history, a balance that, current models suggest, depended on Andean uplift remaining within a comparatively narrow pace relative to basin floor subsidence. Climate conditions across the basin provided the additional ingredient of sustained, abundant precipitation necessary to keep the resulting depression filled with water rather than accumulating only periodically. The basin's equatorial position placed it within the zone of consistent influence from the intertropical convergence zone, the band of atmospheric circulation responsible for sustained high rainfall across much of the tropics, a positioning that, combined with low elevation and proximity to moisture sources from both the Atlantic and the rising Andes, sustained rainfall totals estimated, based on isotopic analysis of preserved plant material, at levels comparable to or exceeding those recorded across the modern Amazon today. Without rainfall of this magnitude and consistency, the accommodation space created by tectonic subsidence would have remained largely dry rather than developing into the extensive wetland system documented in the geological record. The continental configuration surrounding the basin during the Miocene differed from its modern arrangement in ways that further shaped the system's development. The Isthmus of Panama, which today separates the Pacific and Caribbean basins, had not yet fully formed during the early and middle Miocene, leaving a more open marine connection between the Pacific and Caribbean that influenced regional circulation patterns in ways current paleoclimate models continue to investigate. This open configuration is considered a plausible contributing factor to the periodic marine and brackish water incursions documented in the northern reaches of the PBAS system, since a more open Caribbean connection would have facilitated episodic seawater influence reaching further inland than would be possible under the more restricted modern configuration following the isthmus's eventual closure. Drainage direction across the basin depended on the relative elevation gradient between the foreland depression and its surrounding outlets, a gradient that evolved as Andean uplift proceeded unevenly across different mountain segments and as the eastern shield regions of Brazil and Guyana experienced their own, comparatively gradual and largely independent patterns of uplift and erosion. During earlier phases of the system's history, the gentle northward gradient toward the Caribbean apparently exceeded the gradient toward the Atlantic, establishing the northward flowing drainage documented in early Pebus age sediment. Only as differential uplift across the basin's margins shifted this balance, a process unfolding gradually across several million years rather than through any single tectonic event, did the gradient reverse sufficiently to establish the eastward flowing configuration that would eventually characterize the modern Amazon. Direct geological confirmation of this causal sequence comes from provenance studies tracking sediment mineral composition deposited across the basin, but detrital zircon grains, microscopic crystals resistant to weathering and datable through radiometric analysis, recovered from progressively younger layers within the Pebus sequence, show a measurable shift in age distribution, transitioning from a mixture dominated by ancient crystalline material derived from the stable cratonic shields to the east, toward an increasing proportion of comparatively young zircon ages consistent with active volcanic and metamorphic processes occurring within the rising Andes. This shift in sediment provenance, documented across multiple independent localities spanning the basin, confirms that Andean uplift and erosion became the dominant sediment source for the system precisely during the interval when the wetland complex began to develop, supporting the broader causal model linking mountain building directly to the formation of the basin in which the Pebus system subsequently formed. The pace of this transition varied across different segments of the basin, reflecting the segmented, non-uniform nature of Andean uplift itself. Provenance signals from the northern portion of the system, closer to the more rapidly uplifting eastern Cordillera in present-day Colombia, show an earlier and more pronounced shift toward Andean-derived sediment than equivalent signals recovered further south, where uplift along the corresponding mountain segments proceeded somewhat later and at a comparatively reduced rate. This geographic variation in timing demonstrates that the foreland basin did not respond as a single uniformly evolving feature, but as a composite system whose individual segments developed in response to the specific tectonic history of the adjacent mountain segment feeding sediment into it, a level of complexity that current reconstructions continue to refine as additional data become available from previously under-examined portions of the basin. The combination required to produce a system of this scale, sustained tectonic subsidence balanced against sediment supply, equatorial rainfall sufficient to keep the depression persistently flooded, and a continental configuration permitting periodic marine influence along an otherwise enclosed margin, represents a specific intersection of conditions not easily replicated elsewhere on Earth's surface either before or since, a fact that helps account for the absence of any comparable freshwater system, past or present. The influence of the Pebus system extended well beyond the immediate boundaries of the wetland complex itself, shaping ecological and evolutionary processes across the wider South American continent in ways that persisted long after the system's eventual decline. Among the most significant of these influences was the system's documented role as an unusually productive engine of aquatic biological diversification, a pattern identified primarily through the exceptional richness of the mollusk fossil record preserved within its sediment. This exceptional diversity is attributed by current models to the combination of habitat heterogeneity, environmental stability over a sustained 13 million-year interval, and the sheer physical scale of the system, factors that together permitted sustained, large-scale speciation within mollusk lineages largely isolated from the more variable freshwater conditions prevailing elsewhere on the continent during the same interval. This pattern of elevated diversification was not restricted to mollusks alone. Genetic studies of several modern Amazonian aquatic lineages, including certain fish and aquatic plant groups, have identified divergence timing among related species that corresponds closely to the period of the PBAS system's existence, leading researchers to propose that the system functioned as what has been termed a diversification pump, a sustained period of habitat stability and environmental complexity during which numerous aquatic lineages underwent significant speciation, with the resulting diversity subsequently persisting and further diversifying across the modern Amazon basin following the PBAS system's eventual transformation. This hypothesis, while requiring continued testing through additional molecular and fossil evidence, provides a plausible mechanistic link between the ancient wetland system and the exceptional aquatic biodiversity documented across the modern Amazon today. Sediment transported through the system over its 13-million-year history accumulated to depths, in places exceeding several hundred meters, material that would eventually contribute directly to the formation of depositional features extending far beyond the basin itself. As drainage direction across the basin gradually shifted from its earlier northward orientation toward the eastward configuration characterizing the modern Amazon, accumulated and newly eroded sediment began reaching the Atlantic margin in progressively greater volume, contributing to the initial development of depositional features along the eastern South American coast that would, over subsequent millions of years, grow into the substantial submarine sediment accumulation now documented offshore from the modern Amazon's mouth. The system's influence on terrestrial landscapes bordering its margins operated through mechanisms distinct from its role in aquatic diversification. Soil composition across portions of the modern western Amazon basin retains a measurable geochemical signature attributable to the extended history of PBAS system sedimentation, with soils developed atop former PBAS age deposits showing nutrient profiles including elevated calcium and phosphorus concentrations relative to soils developed on older, more thoroughly weathered cratonic material elsewhere in the basin, distinct from those developed on younger, less nutrient-enriched alluvial deposits associated with the modern river system. This geochemical legacy is considered a contributing factor to documented patterns of elevated soil fertility and corresponding forest productivity across portions of the western Amazon today, a pattern with measurable consequences for modern forest structure, biomass, and species composition that traces directly back to sedimentary processes operating many millions of years before the modern forest itself existed. The system's role as a barrier or corridor to terrestrial animal movement across the basin represents a further dimension of its continental scale influence, one with direct consequences for patterns of speciation among terrestrial, non-aquatic lineages. For animal populations unable to cross extensive open water or persistently flooded terrain, the PBAS system's vast extent would have functioned as a substantial barrier to gene flow between populations located on opposite sides of the wetland complex, a condition favorable to allopatric speciation, the process by which physically separated populations diverge into distinct species over time due to the absence of interbreeding. Current models propose that this barrier effect, sustained across the system's full 13-million-year duration, contributed to the diversification of several terrestrial mammal and reptile lineages, whose modern descendants show genetic and morphological divergence patterns consistent with a deep historical separation corresponding to the geographic extent of the ancient wetland system. Among the clearest documented examples of this diversification process is the genus Pachydon, a group of freshwater bivalves whose fossil record within Pebus-aged deposits shows an unusually large number of closely related species, distinguished by subtle but consistent differences in shell shape, size, and ornamentation. This pattern, in which a single ancestral lineage diversifies into numerous closely related species, occupying slightly different ecological niches within the same broader habitat, parallels the species flocks documented among cichlid fish in the modern African rift lakes, widely studied examples of rapid, sustained diversification within a single, long-lived, environmentally stable lake system. The presence of a comparable pattern within the Pebas system's bivalve fauna provides one of the clearest documented instances of this evolutionary process occurring within a freshwater system anywhere in the pre-Quaternary fossil record, predating the well-known African examples by more than 10 million years. Quantitative estimates of total sediment volume transported and deposited across the Pebas system's history, derived from integrating measured deposit thickness across mapped basin area, place the cumulative sediment mass in the range of several 100,000 cubic kilometers accumulated over the system's 13 million year duration, a volume broadly comparable to estimates of total sediment output from the modern Amazon River over an equivalent time span, despite the substantially different hydrological character of the two systems. This comparison indicates that, even accounting for structural differences between a vast wetland complex and a confined modern river channel, the overall scale of erosional and depositional processes linking the rising Andes to the South American lowland remained remarkably consistent in total magnitude across this extended interval, underscoring the persistent role of Andean uplift as the primary engine driving sediment transport, regardless of the specific downstream hydrological configuration through which that sediment ultimately passed. Considered together, these multiple, mechanistically distinct pathways of influence, aquatic diversification driven by sustained habitat stability, downstream sediment contribution to coastal depositional systems, soil enrichment shaping contemporary forest productivity, and barrier-driven terrestrial speciation demonstrate that the Pebas system functioned not merely as a regional wetland, but as a continental-scale evolutionary and geological force, one whose consequences continue to be documented within the biological and geological structure of the modern Amazon basin many millions of years after the system itself ceased to exist in its original form. Approximately 10.5 million years ago, sediment and faunal evidence from across the Pebas system begins to document a measurable shift away from the conditions that had characterized the system throughout most of its preceding history, marking the onset of a transition that would, over the following 1.5 million years, fundamentally alter the basin's hydrological character. This shift did not occur as a sudden event, but as a gradual reorganization of drainage patterns, sediment supply, and water chemistry, the cumulative effect of tectonic and climatic processes that had operated throughout the system's existence, but which began, during this interval, to push the basin's overall balance in a new direction. The most significant driver of this reorganization was the continued uneven uplift of the Andes and the adjacent Eastern Shield regions, a process that gradually increased the elevation gradient toward the Atlantic relative to the gradient toward the system's earlier northern outlet. As this eastward gradient strengthened, drainage across the basin increasingly favored a more direct, eastward flowing configuration over the slower, more diffuse northward flow that had characterized the system's earlier history, a transition documented in paleocurrent indicators from this interval, which show an increasing proportion of eastward-oriented flow measurements relative to the predominantly northward orientations recorded in older sediment. This reorganization of drainage had direct consequences for the system's connection to the Caribbean, and correspondingly for the periodic marine and brackish water incursions that had shaped portions of the system's northern reaches throughout much of its history. Geochemical evidence from mollusk shells recovered from this transitional interval shows a marked decline in the frequency and intensity of brackish water signatures compared to earlier portions of the sequence, consistent with a progressive reduction in marine connectivity as the basin's drainage reoriented away from its earlier northern outlet. Mollusk taxa specifically adapted to brackish or marine-influenced conditions, abundant in earlier deposits, become correspondingly less common in sediment from this interval, their reduced presence offering a direct faunal signature of the basin's changing hydrological connectivity. As eastward drainage strengthened, the basin's overall capacity to retain standing water across its full historical extent began to diminish. A more efficient, more direct outlet to the Atlantic increased the rate at which water and sediment could exit the system, gradually reducing the proportion of the basin occupied by the open water, lagoon, and persistent backswamp environments that had defined much of the system's earlier character, while increasing the relative extent of better drained, more conventionally fluvial floodplain habitat. This shift is documented in the changing ratio of lacustrine to fluvial sediment facies recovered from cores spanning this interval, with fluvial indicators, including cross-bedded channel sands and well-developed point bar sequences, becoming progressively more common relative to the fine-grained, organic-rich lacustrine deposits that had dominated earlier portions of the sequence. Ecosystems dependent on the specific combination of conditions that had characterized the mature PBAS system faced increasing pressure as this transition advanced. Mollusk lineages whose diversification had depended on the system's exceptional habitat stability and the persistence of specific lacustrine and lagoonal subenvironments began to show measurable declines in total diversity through this interval, with several previously well-represented genera, including multiple species within the diversified Pachyodon lineage, becoming progressively rarer in sediment from the later portions of the transitional sequence before disappearing from the record entirely in deposits dating to the system's final phase. Vertebrate populations dependent on the system's most extensive open water habitat similarly faced a contracting resource base as that habitat diminished in relative extent. Crocodilian lineages specialized for filter feeding across broad, shallow lake environments, including Murasuchus, are documented with declining frequency in deposits from this interval, a pattern consistent with the progressive reduction in the specific lake and lagoon habitat upon which this feeding strategy depended, though direct causal attribution remains constrained by the inherent difficulty of distinguishing habitat loss from other potential contributing factors. Using fossil climatic conditions across the broader region appear to have contributed an additional layer of pressure to this already shifting hydrological balance. Pollen assemblages recovered from sediment spanning this transitional interval show a gradual increase in the relative proportion of taxa associated with more seasonal, less permanently saturated conditions, alongside a corresponding decline in pollen from the most strictly flood-dependent palm and wetland tree lineages that had dominated earlier portions of the sequence. This pattern is broadly consistent with the global late Miocene cooling and aridification trend documented across multiple independent paleoclimate proxies worldwide during this general interval, a trend that, while operating at a global scale, unrelated specifically to the PBAS system's own tectonic and drainage history, may have compounded the basin's already changing hydrological balance by reducing the consistency and total volume of equatorial rainfall feeding the system at precisely the same time that improved drainage efficiency was independently reducing the system's capacity to retain standing water. Mega-herbivore populations occupying the system's shoreline and floodplain margins faced consequences from this changing landscape distinct from those documented among aquatic taxa. Note ungulate and astropo, their fossil localities from this interval, show a measurable shift in spatial distribution relative to earlier deposits, with recovered material increasingly concentrated in association with the better drained, more conventionally fluvial sediment facies that were becoming progressively more extensive across the basin, rather than the dense, semi-aquatic marginal habitat preferentially occupied by these same lineages during the system's earlier, more lacustrine-dominated phase. This redistribution suggests these herbivore populations tracked the changing availability of their preferred habitat type as it shifted in relative extent, rather than maintaining fixed geographic ranges independent of the environmental transformation occurring around them. Not all lineages experienced this transition as a uniform decline. Species and genera better adapted to the more variable, channel-dominated conditions characterizing the emerging fluvial landscape, including several catfish and other fish lineages already adapted to turbid, fast-moving water rather than stable, stratified lake conditions, appear to have maintained or even modestly increased their relative representation within the fossil assemblage across this same transitional interval, indicating that the changing balance of conditions favored some components of the systems. This uneven response across different lineages illustrates that the transition unfolding across the basin during this interval represented not a uniform collapse, but a selective reorganization in which the specific habitat requirements of individual species determined whether the changing hydrological balance constituted a threat, a neutral shift, or, for a smaller number of taxa, an emerging opportunity within the gradually transforming landscape. By approximately 9.5 million years ago, the gradual reorganization documented in the preceding interval had progressed to the point where the PBAS system's defining characteristics, the vast interconnected lake and lagoon network, the continuous open water expanses extending beyond the horizon, the sustained marine and brackish influence along its northern margin, no longer described the basin's prevailing condition. In their place, sediment evidence documents a landscape increasingly dominated by a conventional, channel-confined fluvial system, fragmented from its predecessor's continuous wetland mosaic into a pattern of discrete river channels separated by progressively better-drained floodplain rather than persistent standing water. This fragmentation proceeded unevenly across the basin rather than as a uniform, simultaneous transformation. Sediment cores from the system's southern and western margins, positioned closer to the primary sources of both Andean sediment supply and the strengthening eastward drainage gradient, document the transition to fluvial-dominated conditions occurring earlier than equivalent transitions documented in cores recovered from the system's more central and northern reaches, where remnant lake and lagoon environments persisted longer before eventually succumbing to the same basin-wide drainage reorganization. This geographic asymmetry produced, for a period likely spanning several 100,000 years, a genuinely fragmented landscape in which isolated remnant lakes and lagoons, increasingly disconnected from one another by intervening, newly established floodplain and channel terrain, persisted as shrinking refugia for the specialized aquatic fauna that had characterized the system's earlier, more continuous phase. The biological consequences of this fragmentation proved severe for lineages whose evolutionary success had depended specifically on the scale and continuity of the earlier system. Mollusk diversity, which had reached levels unmatched by any other freshwater depositional system in the fossil record during the PBAS system's mature phase, declined sharply through this final interval, with total documented species richness in the youngest sediment from this transition falling to a small fraction of the diversity recorded from deposits corresponding to the system's earlier maximum extent. This decline reflects not a gradual, proportional reduction across all mollusk lineages equally, but a disproportionate loss concentrated among taxa adapted to the stable, large-volume lacustrine and lagoonal conditions that fragmentation was actively eliminating, while a smaller number of generalist, flood-tolerant taxa persisted into the succeeding fluvial system and would eventually contribute to the considerably reduced, though still substantial, mollusk diversity characterizing the modern Amazon basin. Among vertebrates, the system's largest apex predators experienced a comparable contraction tied directly to the disappearance of the specific habitat conditions. Their extreme body size and specialized hunting strategies had depended upon. Curosaurus, whose evolutionary trajectory had been characterized by progressive size increase, linked to competition for premium ambush territory within a vast continuous wetland, is documented with declining frequency and, in the youngest deposits associated with this interval, declining maximum body size. Current models attribute this pattern to the disappearance of the dense continuous backwater and channel margin habitat upon which this genus's ambush hunting strategy had depended, rather than to any single, identifiable catastrophic event, with the giant crocodilians' eventual disappearance from the regional fossil record occurring as the culmination of extended habitat contraction, rather than as a discrete extinction event confined to a narrow interval of time. Murasuchus, similarly dependent on the broad, shallow lake habitat that fragmentation was actively eliminating, disappears from the regional fossil record at a comparable point in this sequence. Its filter-feeding strategy rendered non-viable once the extensive, stable lake environments required to sustain dense fish schools no longer existed in sufficient extent anywhere within the transforming basin. The disappearance of these two highly specialized predator lineages, each adapted to a specific component of the mature system's habitat mosaic that fragmentation systematically eliminated, illustrates the broader pattern characterizing this final phase, not a sudden system-wide collapse affecting all taxa simultaneously, but a sequential, habitat-specific unraveling in which each lineage's persistence or disappearance tracked the specific fate of the environmental conditions its evolutionary history had most closely bound it to. Vegetation across the basin underwent a parallel transformation as the wetland forest that had depended on near-continuous flooding gave way to plant communities better suited to the increasingly seasonal, better-drained conditions of the emerging fluvial landscape. Pollen assemblages from this final interval document a marked decline in the proportional representation of Mauritia and other strongly flood-dependent palm taxa that had dominated the basin's wetland forest throughout the system's mature phase, replaced by an increasing proportion of taxa associated with seasonally flooded or non-flooded forest types, more comparable to the Varzea and Terra Firme categories recognized across the modern Amazon basin today. This vegetational transition, proceeding alongside and likely reinforcing the broader hydrological fragmentation, represents the final disappearance of that palm-dominated wetland forest ecosystem. Its loss, tracking the same habitat contraction responsible for the contemporaneous decline among the system's specialized aquatic, and semi-aquatic fauna. Mega-herbivore lineages dependent on the marginal, semi-aquatic shoreline habitat that had supported their feeding ecology throughout the system's earlier history faced a correspondingly diminished resource base, as that habitat type contracted alongside the broader wetland fragmentation. Astrapothere fossil material becomes progressively rarer in deposits dating to this final interval, with the youngest securely dated specimens recovered from the broader region corresponding closely to the period of most severe habitat fragmentation documented in the sediment record, a pattern consistent with, though not definitively proving, a causal link between the contraction of suitable semi-aquatic shoreline habitat and the eventual disappearance of this lineage from the regional fossil record. Note ungulate lineages possessing somewhat more flexible dietary and habitat requirements than the more specialized astrapotheres persisted somewhat longer into the transition, though several taxa most closely associated with the wetland margin show comparable patterns of declining abundance through this same sequence. By approximately 8 million years ago, sediment and faunal evidence across the great majority of the former Pebas system's geographic extent had come to resemble, in broad structural terms, a conventional large river floodplain system considerably more similar to the modern Amazon than to the vast, continuous wetland complex that had occupied the same basin only a few million years earlier. The transformation, though gradual and extended across more than 2 million years from its earliest documented signs to its effective completion, nonetheless represents the permanent disappearance of a hydrological and ecological configuration unmatched before or since anywhere in the global geological record, its conclusion marking not a sudden death, but the final stage of an extended, geologically documented decline, driven by the same tectonic forces that had originally brought the system into existence. Direct physical evidence of the Pebas system survives today in scattered, often difficult to access outcrops across portions of present-day Peru, Colombia, and Brazil, the majority of the original basin remaining buried beneath younger sediment and dense modern forest cover that prevents direct surface access across most of its former extent. Where this evidence does reach the surface, it does so primarily through localized tectonic uplift or erosional exposure, processes that have, in a small number of locations, brought ancient sediment layers into contact with the modern land surface for the first time since their original deposition. Among the most significant of these exposures is the Fitzcarrald Arch, a broad zone of localized uplift in southeastern Peru where deep crustal processes, unrelated to the Andean orogeny responsible for the basin's formation, have pushed portions of the ancient Pebas sequence upward and exposed them along eroded riverbanks and bluffs cut by modern Amazonian tributaries. This uplift, occurring well after the system's own decline, provides researchers direct access to sediment layers that would otherwise remain buried under hundreds of meters of younger material across most of the original basin, making the Fitzcarrald Arch one of the single most productive sources of fossil material documenting the system's biological and environmental history. A second major source of evidence comes from the La Venta fossil locality in present-day Colombia, where erosion along the Magdalena River Valley has exposed an extensive sequence of Miocene-aged sediment correlating closely in age and to a considerable degree in faunal composition with deposits from the broader Pebas system. Though positioned at the geographic margin of the broader basin rather than within its central depositional area, La Venta has yielded an exceptionally rich and well-preserved fossil assemblage, including much of the skeletal material documenting Astrapotheres, Nota ungulates, and several other large mammal lineages that occupied the shoreline and floodplain margins of the wetland system during the Middle Miocene. The remainder of the available physical evidence derives substantially from sources never intended for paleontological purposes. Boreholes drilled across the western Amazon basin in the course of petroleum and natural gas exploration have recovered core samples penetrating deep into the PBAS sediment sequence at locations scattered across the basin's interior, locations that would otherwise remain inaccessible to direct geological investigation given the absence of natural outcrop exposure across the densely forested, low-relief landscape covering most of the basin's surface. While these cores typically yield small sample volumes unsuited to recovering large, complete skeletal material, they provide invaluable microfossil, pollen, and sediment geochemistry data unobtainable from the limited number of larger outcrop exposures alone, complementing the more visually dramatic but geographically restricted evidence from sites like the Fitzcarrolled Arch and La Venta. Preservation of fossil material within PBAS-aged sediment depended heavily on specific taphonomic conditions governing how organic remains were buried and altered prior to fossilization. Rapid burial in fine-grained, oxygen-poor mud, characteristic of the system's backswamp and deep channel environments, proved particularly favorable to preservation, slowing decomposition sufficiently to allow mineral replacement of organic tissue to proceed before bacterial and physical degradation could destroy fine anatomical detail. Material recovered from these low oxygen settings frequently retains delicate features, including fine surface texture on bone and shell, and, in exceptional cases, soft tissue impressions that would not survive burial under the more oxygen-rich, rapidly fluctuating conditions characteristic of higher energy channel sediment, where bone material more typically survives only as fragmented, heavily abraded pieces transported some distance from their original point of deposition. The interpretive process by which scattered fossil material recovered across widely separated localities and accumulated gradually over more than a century of intermittent investigation has been assembled into a coherent reconstruction of the PBAS system required integrating evidence from numerous independent disciplines operating at different scales of resolution. Sedimentology and stratigraphy established the basic chronological and environmental framework within which individual fossil discoveries could be placed, while paleontological description of specific specimens provided the biological detail filling that framework, and geochemical and isotopic analysis added quantitative resolution to questions of climate, salinity, and water depth that skeletal and sedimentary evidence alone could not fully resolve. No single discovery or research program produced this reconstruction. Rather, it emerged incrementally across decades of cross-referenced evidence from sources as varied as petroleum boreholes, academic field expeditions, and opportunistic discoveries made by local residents along eroding riverbanks in remote portions of the basin. Precise chronological control over this sediment sequence, essential to placing fossil discoveries within an accurate timeline, depends substantially on volcanic ash layers, or tephra, interbedded within the PBAS sequence at several localities. These ash layers, deposited episodically as eruptions from the active Andean volcanic arc, carried fine airborne material eastward across the basin, can be dated with considerable precision through radiometric analysis of mineral crystals within the ash itself, providing fixed chronological reference points against which the surrounding, harder-to-date sedimentary layers can be calibrated. Without these scattered but precise volcanic markers, establishing the detailed timeline of environmental change documented throughout this account, including the dating of the system's formation, its periods of maximum extent, and its eventual fragmentation and decline, would rest on considerably less secure footing, dependent instead on less precise methods, including biostratigraphic correlation, and broader regional sediment accumulation rate estimates. The recovery of any single significant specimen from this record typically represents the culmination of considerable effort under challenging field conditions, with many of the most informative localities accessible only by river travel through remote, sparsely populated regions of the basin, followed by careful excavation in tropical conditions that themselves accelerate decomposition of any exposed organic material not already fully mineralized. Specimens recovered under these conditions frequently require extensive laboratory preparation, sometimes extending across multiple years, before the full scientific information they contain can be properly extracted, described, and incorporated into the broader reconstruction of the system from which they originated, a process that continues actively today as new material accumulates from ongoing fieldwork across the region. This continued, ongoing process of discovery means that current scientific understanding of the PBAS system, substantial though it has become, remains incomplete and subject to revision as additional evidence accumulates from previously unexamined portions of the basin. Large areas of the original depositional system remain entirely unsampled by either outcrop or borehole, their specific environmental and biological history accessible only through interpolation from better documented surrounding regions, a limitation that ensures continued investigation across this region will likely continue to refine and in some cases substantially revise current reconstructions of this vanished system for years to come. Several lineages of aquatic vertebrates occupying the modern Amazon basin trace their evolutionary origins directly to ancestral populations documented within the PBAS system's fossil record, representing living continuations of a biological lineage extending back through the system's 13 million year history and beyond. Among the clearest examples are the river dolphins of the family Ineeidae, whose fossil record within South American freshwater deposits extends into the Miocene interval corresponding to the PBAS system's existence, with skeletal material recovered from sediment of this age, documenting cranial and dental features already closely comparable to those of the modern Amazon river dolphin, indicating that the lineage's distinctive adaptation to navigating turbid, structurally complex freshwater habitat using echolocation rather than vision was established within, or shortly following, the conditions characterizing the ancient wetland system itself. Modern catfish diversity across the Amazon basin similarly traces a direct evolutionary line to the radiations documented within PBAS-aged sediment. Several genera within the family Pimelodidae, prominent among the large catfish lineages recovered from the ancient system's deposits, persist today as recognizable, closely related descendant genera occupying comparable ecological roles within the modern river, relying on the same sensitive barbel and lateral line sensory systems that allowed their Miocene ancestors to hunt effectively in the equally turbid waters of the ancient wetland complex. This continuity of lineage and ecological function across more than 10 million years illustrates that, while the physical scale and structure of the basin's aquatic habitat has changed dramatically since the PBAS system's decline, the fundamental sensory and behavioral adaptations required to exploit a low-visibility freshwater environment have remained evolutionarily stable and continuously useful across this entire interval. Freshwater stingrays of the family Potamotrygonidea, documented within PBAS-aged deposits by fossil dermal denticles and tail spines, persist as a diverse and ecologically significant component of the modern Amazon's fish fauna. Their continued reliance on electroreception to locate prey in sediment-obscured water, representing an unbroken behavioral continuity, extending from the ancient system into the present day. Genetic studies of modern Potamotrygonid diversification have identified divergence timing among several constituent species and genera corresponding closely to the interval immediately following the Pebas system's fragmentation and decline, suggesting that the ecological reorganization accompanying that transition may have itself contributed additional impetus to this lineage's diversification, as newly available fluvial habitat replaced the system's earlier lacustrine and lagoonal configuration. Podocnemidid turtles, among the most heavily preyed upon vertebrates documented within the Pebas system's predator-rich shoreline environment, persist today as the giant South American river turtle and several related species, continuing to inhabit sandy riverbank nesting sites and seasonally flooded forest margins directly comparable, in general ecological terms, to the habitat their Miocene ancestors occupied within the ancient wetland system, despite the dramatic reduction in overall habitat extent and the substantial restructuring of basin drainage that has occurred across the intervening millions of years. Air-breathing fish lineages present within the Pebas system maintain a comparable evolutionary continuity into the modern basin. The Arapaima, among the largest freshwater fish alive today, belongs to the same osteoglossid lineage documented within Pebas-age deposits, retaining the modified vascularized swim bladder that allowed its Miocene ancestors to supplement gill respiration in the chronically low oxygen backwater conditions of the ancient wetland system, an adaptation that continues to provide a measurable advantage in comparable low oxygen habitat persisting within portions of the modern Amazon floodplain. Today, South American lungfish, similarly continuous with Pebas system populations documented through fossil material indicating an already well-established capacity for aerial respiration and mud-burrowing estivation, persist as a recognizable component of the modern basin's fish fauna. Their survival strategy essentially unchanged across an interval spanning the entire transformation of the basin's hydrology from continuous mega-wetland to confined modern river system. Smaller-scale echoes of the ancient system's defining characteristics persist today within several protected wetland areas across the modern western Amazon basin, most notably the Pacaya Samiria National Reserve in Peru, a seasonally flooded forest and lake complex covering approximately 20,000 square kilometers, an area less than 2% the size of the Pebas system at its historical maximum extent, yet structurally and ecologically reminiscent of the ancient wetland in several respects. Seasonal flooding within this modern reserve inundates extensive areas of palm-dominated forest in a pattern directly comparable, in general mechanism if not absolute scale, to the flood regime documented throughout the Pebas system's own history, supporting a correspondingly dense concentration of large aquatic vertebrates, including river dolphins, giant river turtles, and substantial caiman populations, within a comparatively confined geographic area. While dramatically reduced in scale, this modern wetland complex offers researchers a partial, present-day analog for understanding the ecological dynamics that would have operated across the vastly larger ancient system. Beyond these direct lineage and ecological continuities, the physical landscape of the modern western Amazon basin retains visible, tangible traces of the ancient system's geological history. Pebas Formation sediment, the consolidated remnant of the ancient system's accumulated deposits, forms exposed bluffs and riverbank cliffs at numerous points across the modern landscape, recognizable to local observers and geologists alike by their distinctive blue-gray clay coloration and characteristic fossil content, providing an immediately visible, physically tangible connection between the modern riverside landscape and the vanished wetland system whose sediment now underlies it. These exposures, weathering gradually under modern tropical rainfall and continuing to erode along actively migrating river channels, represent a slow, ongoing process of re-exposure through which previously buried fossil material continues to be returned to the surface even today, more than 8 million years after the system's effective transformation into a conventional fluvial landscape. The distinction recognized today between the Amazon basin's whitewater and blackwater river systems, a contrast in sediment load, dissolved nutrient content, and water color readily apparent to anyone traveling across the modern basin, traces in part to differences in sediment source and geological history that originate from this ancient period. Rivers draining areas where PEBAS-derived, nutrient-enriched sediment remains prominent in the contributing watershed tend toward the sediment-rich, nutrient-laden whitewater character associated with rivers such as the modern Amazon's main channel, while rivers draining areas dominated by older, more thoroughly weathered shield terrain, comparatively unaffected by PEBAS system sedimentation, more typically display the darker, sediment-poor blackwater character associated with rivers such as the Rio Negro, a distinction whose geological roots extend, in measurable part, back to the specific sedimentary processes documented throughout this account of the vanished mega-river system that once occupied this basin.